this is the main page that you'll come to for IPUMS NHGIS. This is again, it's a free website. We do require registration. We ask you to provide an email address because our data gets processed by our automated system after you submit it. We send you an email when the data are ready because it can take 5, 10, 15 minutes for the data file to be prepared. And so we ask that you register. We also use the registered users and data requests as in our grant proposals to show the utility of these data that we have. So you come into our site, and the key thing you want to do to start is we've got this big Get Data button here on the main page. So you go ahead and click on Get Data, and that will take you into what we call our data finder. And we use a filtering modality to see what we have. So behind the scenes here, we have data from 1790 to the present. We've got upwards of kind of 50,000 data tables that we have in our collection. And we use these filters to figure out what's available for various time periods, for various topics, and for various geographic units like counties or census tracts. So the way I typically would approach this as a new user is I want you to focus on your years and your geographic levels as your two places to start. The data sets filter is very powerful once you know what data sets mean, but for a new user, it's very daunting. So I don't want to go into those details today. But let's say you're interested in looking at housing in 1950, and that's your general topic of interest. And you want this housing data for neighborhoods or what I call census tracts. So what I would do is I would click on the years button, and it's going to open a filter pop-up. And here you can see we've got a bunch of different years here. We've got our decennial census years, all those ending on the 0. Our 5-year ranges are for data that are pooled over a 5-year time period. And our non-decennial years are all those years that end in something other than 0. And we have different data sets that are available for all of the years you see listed here. But I'm going to go ahead and click on the checkbox next to 1950. So now I've selected that, and then I click the Submit button here at the lower right-hand corner, and that's going to apply that filter for me. So down in the lower part of the screen, we have our Select Data Grid. And down here, you can see that we have 187 source tables that relate to 1950. We have 7 GIS files, the mapping files that you can use, and 2 time series tables that we've put together. Time series tables are where we've identified comparable statistics over various time periods, and you can download those in a single data file. But 187 source tables is a lot, and I don't actually know if all of these apply at the census tract level. So now I want to add a filter to let me see what's available for census tracts. So now I click on the geographic levels filter, and it gives me another pop-up. And we default to showing you the most popular geographic levels for which census data are published. And you'll see we have the nation, the state, the county, the census tract, the block group, and the block. The grayed out geographic levels mean that there's no data available for the other filters that are in place. So for example, census blocks are not available in NHGIS in 1950. But you can see here that census tracts are green and bold. So I can click the plus icon next to census tract, and then I'll click the Submit button again to apply the filter. Now in my data filter, you can see that we have 54 source tables that are available for census tracts in 1950. And so now I would actually just browse through these tables and figure out what do I have access to here at the tract level, and what do I want to actually download and analyze. So you can see we have individuals, we have total population counts, we have population for race, and if I click on the hyperlink, I can see what the race categories are. And we use the terminology that was used at the time of the 1950 census. So in the census publications, they have data on 3 different race categories: white, Negro, and other non-white as kind of the everybody else. So those three categories exhaustively cover all persons in the U.S. And so we have the counts for those three subgroups. If we scroll down, I want to see what we have for housing statistics. And now I can see that we have a table for total dwelling units. That's going to tell me just how many housing units there are in the census tract. I can find out information on tenure and vacancy status. So whether or not a housing unit was owner occupied or renter occupied. If a housing unit was it vacant for rent or for sale, or was it an other category? You see a lot of these other categories in these decennial census counts. We can also get dwelling units with non-white occupants by tenure. So if a person identifies as non-white, we can look at whether or not the housing unit counts were owner occupied or renter occupied. You can go down the list here and build the custom data set that you want. You can add one up to all of these data tables to your data cart, and then you will get that delivered to you as a data file, typically as a comma-separated value file that you can use in R or Python or Excel or your stats package of choice. And you can have all of that in one place to analyze in a variety of different ways. Now, in lots of cases, you just kind of have to look through the tables, the universe statements, and some of our categories here to figure out what's going to fit your use case or your analysis. But that's typically how I approach the initial entree into checking this out. Now, if we wanted to push farther on the topics, just to show that off, let's say I was interested in the housing topics in a focal point. I'd open the topics filter, and what I would do is over on our left-hand side, we have a few different tabs for population, housing, agriculture. If I click on housing, you can see the different housing statistics tables that are available. And let's say I'm interested in housing value. I click on that, the plus icon next to that row, and I click submit. We can see that we have value statistics. There's just two tables related to value, the median value and the value that's reported for various various bins of statistics. So less than $3,000, $3,000 to $3,999, just giving you a sense of what that looks like. And these are all reported in 1940 or 1950 dollars. So that's how I approach kind of the browsing and introduction to our website. And I would say that the more time you spend on it, the more confident you get, and also starting small. So starting with 1 year, one geographic level, familiarize yourself with that before you start to expand beyond.
And so I noticed that, if this type of search, as compared to like at the 1950s, the Census Bureau site, right, where there's all those scanned in things, it has you able to search for like your specific county. So here, that's not one of the filters, because
So we essentially have data for 1950, right? Let's say 1950. We have data for all counties that were in existence at the time of that census. So when you get the data file from us, you are going to get that file for all 3,000 or so counties that were in existence in 1950, and you'll get that in your CSV file. And I've always been of the mind that people know how they want to filter when they get the data file out themselves. And so I would say get the data file, open it in your software package of choice, and figure out, if it existed in 1950, it's going to be there. But yeah, we don't support the filtering, because as it turns out, doing the filtering by geographic unit, by county name or city name, it's actually way harder than we expected it to be to get that searching correct. And so to make our front end system less confusing, we've taken that from our user interface.
Yeah, I think I got a taste of that, when I was playing around, and I actually wasn't sure with the you have like in the geographic levels, there's like an option for like a combination. I forget the term that was used,
Oh,
but I thought to myself like, okay,
a
just
comp, yeah,
yes,
compound geographic
of
level.
course
Yeah,
that caught my eye because
yeah,
why? Yeah, why
that's one of
keep
the
it
most
simple?
that is one of the most confusing concepts on our site, and it gets to the fact that the Census Bureau publishes statistics, these summary statistics for a couple of hundred geographic levels every
Mhm.
time they publish data. And so what we're showing here are every unit you get is a whole unit. It's a whole county or a whole census tract or a whole state. Well, as it turns out, geography in the census is substantially more complicated than that. And
Mhm.
compound levels would be something like, I want the counts of individuals who reside on tribal lands in the state of Arizona. Well, tribal lands can cross state boundaries, right? They're
Oh,
not fixed within states. So if you get data on tribal lands and for whole tribal lands and data for states, you don't really know which portion of that tribal land is in Arizona or New Mexico or Nevada or another state that borders Arizona. So these compound levels let you drill down to find the Arizona specific portion of a tribal land, for
oh,
example. And there's a lot of them, and they can be very confusing. And that's definitely a more power user
okay.
focused area. I answer a lot of user support questions about
Around
what
that.
these compound levels are, and they're much more common in the more recent censuses. So from 1990 to the present, compound geographies are pretty common. From 1980 going backwards in time, they're much less common because most of the data we have was published in paper volumes. And so they just didn't print that many paper volumes to drill down into those different cross-cutting units of geography.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to know. As I think, the interest in knowing or, including information about the first people that were in your area and like where that land was,
Mhm.
is something I know just for some advocacy projects. And so it's cool to have that note in here that that data, when it became available, is also included.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Well, now I know what that's for. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, okay. Well, I see you have some other items to share
Yeah.
before we switch out of the screen share mode. I
Yeah. Yeah.
want to let you
Yeah.
talk about these other tabs.
So one of the things that we've been working on for the last 3 years since our last grant cycle started is we have been working to create city block or census block mapping files for the 1980 and 1970 decennial censuses. So census blocks are essentially the smallest geographic unit for which the Bureau tabulates and publishes data. And in an urban area, you can really think of it as a city block that's bounded by, 4 streets if it's a pure grid system. The Bureau has been publishing demographic and housing data for city blocks from actually since 1940. Starting in 1970 and in 1980, they published digital versions, so data that were on tapes or now in data files. But there were no mapping files to go along with those. They published paper maps that showed the locations of the census blocks, but there were no digital files available to kind of visualize and put those on the map and do analysis for it. Well, we've been working on building those data files, and over the last probably about 8 to 9 months, we've done a few releases of the census block boundaries, and we've put together a little visualization of Minneapolis and St. Paul looking at these 1980 census blocks, and you get to see some what I think are some interesting patterns. And so I just want to kind of talk through this map and give you a sense of what we've got. So this top map here shows you the percentage of the population that identifies as African American or Black in the 1980 census, and the darker blue colors are higher percent Black. So you can see in 1980 in Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's kind of three major neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods. We've got a neighborhood in the northeast of downtown Minneapolis. We've got a neighborhood that extends down Interstate 35W in the central part of Minneapolis. Then we have a neighborhood that is around University Avenue, which is one of the main thoroughfares of St. Paul. You can see that these are fairly, I think, showing high levels of segregation at the block level. They're fairly clustered in these three areas. Well, what we can do is then we can actually see, well, what does that look like over time? So if I turn off the 1980 block boundaries, I'll kind of flash these. If I look at the 80 again, then you can see that in the northern part of Minneapolis, we're seeing a higher percent Black kind of move north out of this initial cluster. We see a little bit of more diffusion in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. And if we bring this up to the present in 2010, we see that the east side of St. Paul has seen more African Americans, or more people identifying as African Americans, residing in those neighborhoods. We see that northeast, the area directly north of downtown Minneapolis, we see a higher percent African American in that neighborhood. It's kind of movement of the population over time. But interestingly, right, until we put this data out, we didn't realize how kind of segregated and clustered this area was in 1980. And by putting the 1980 block data out there, we were able to uncover that. The other nice thing that we can do is kind of add two other contextual pieces of information in here. So we have the HOLC redlining zones that were delineated in the 1930s by the Homeowners Ownership Loan Corporation. And you can see here the red polygons are the areas graded as D, so that the areas that the HOLC said should not get investment from banks. And we can see that now we have neighborhoods that were predominantly white in 1980 getting low grades, but we've got this area here in St. Paul. We've got a degraded area that is very closely aligned with the neighborhood, the high African American neighborhood in the central part of St. Paul. And we have this stretch coming straight down what became Interstate 35W, really kind of mirroring that north-south stretch in the city of Minneapolis. The other thing that we can do, and this highlights work that started here in Minneapolis, is look at racially restrictive deed covenants that were put into place in the early 20th century that essentially precluded homeowners from selling to various groups of people. So African Americans or Jews were often, excluded from purchasing houses because of these racially restrictive deed covenants. Well, a group named Mapping Prejudice has mapped all of those in the city of Minneapolis. And we can see, right, that the areas of these deed covenants in South Minneapolis and in the Powderhorn neighborhood here are, areas that are still to this day predominantly white, high percent white neighborhoods. So we can layer in some of these structural policy decisions that went into place, and how are those kind of impacting the long run demographics of these cities. And by adding the 1980 census blocks in, we've just added in another decade that we can use to look at these patterns. And I think these data are going to be incredibly powerful over time. And we've published them for New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia. We're currently working on Detroit and Washington, D.C. And so we're continually releasing these as we process these block data. But I think that's going to be open a large new thread of research on neighborhood level change over a 40 and 50 year time period.
Yeah, that's actually really striking, to see, you click go through, changing the layers, and so will it eventually be something that's available nationwide for those of us that aren't in major metros? So
So it unfortunately it won't be.
okay,
So the block statistics that were published in 1970 and 1980 were restricted to metropolitan statistical areas. So kind
okay,
of the 300 largest cities in
okay,
America had blocks for them, and we don't have the equivalent statistics for the rest of the country. We don't get the census blocks were not delineated for the entire country until the 1990
okay.
census.
Right, and then I have questions. So
Yeah.
the,
Yes.
the redlining zones, is that something that is part of, um, NHGIS data, or did you have to bring that in?
No, so we brought that in. We brought that in from the Mapping Inequality Project, which
Okay,
is at the University of Richmond,
yeah,
and they digitized all of the HOLC zones. And they have been disseminating those data for 10 or 15 years now. And so we brought those in and overlaid those with our data to see how those correspond with one another.
okay, and same thing for the, mapping prejudice. Is that, focused on Minnesota, or are they
So
nation?
they're expanding. So it
Okay,
started here. It started in Minneapolis and in Hennepin County, and they are collaborating with cities around the country. So
okay.
it's an incredibly labor intensive
Yeah.
job to do that. So what happens is they develop the materials and methodologies,
Okay.
and then they will go out and train local civic organizations or groups who reside in Milwaukee or Washington, D.C. And then those groups in those cities tend to um, um, stand up their own, often crowdsourced projects
Yeah.
to categorize the language. So they have to scan all the deeds and then kind of go in and read them and mark up, this deed was restrictive for some group, and
Wow.
they'll do that transcription and then figure out whether or not it was a restrictive deed or not.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, so there's a lot of work, different, for NHGIS, right? It's decades
Yeah.
to get here. And, then the work of the other groups being brought in, which really speaks to the power of having that geocoded information,
Yeah.
because now like you're able to bring everything together and paint this picture that's really striking.
I think maps are a powerful communication tool. And
Absolutely.
when you can visualize this and put something on a map and show people, you live here, and this is how far you lived from areas of restrictive deed covenants, or you might live in a house that had that. It really is kind of eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people. And until we could make these interactive visualizations and put the data on a map, numbers on a spreadsheet are hard to contextualize.
Right. Exactly. Um, so I don't know if I interrupted you. Did you have another thing to show here?
No, I just saying we this map that I'm showing here is part of there's a blog post that we wrote
Okay.
that was part of a 2021 or 2020 Diversity Fellows project that we have here at IPUMS, and we have a project where we hire a graduate student and an undergraduate. We pair them with a faculty and a staff member to do some kind of demographic or population data project in the summer, funded by the National Science Foundation. So Amalia and Yashwan, who are our two fellows in 2020, were the ones who actually built all of those census block boundaries.
Wow.
So they spent a summer kind of cleaning up some data that we had, and then eventually making the data. And so if you want to learn more about the the narrative behind what you see on that map. We have a blog post here describing that change over the last 40 years here in the Twin Cities.
Right.